This video is about Elizabethan England based on the AQA book of the title, and it refers to the topic of poverty. Elizabethan England had a struggle to deal with the problem of poverty for a number of reasons. Firstly, there had been inflation during this period and wages hadn't kept pace with it. Secondly, there was quite a high level of unemployment. And thirdly, the monasteries that had been used to support the poor had been taken down by Henry VIII, Elizabeth's father. And also there had been a number of poor harvests. All these things contributed towards high levels of poverty. Elizabethan England saw poverty in two forms, one which it saw as being the idle poor and the other was the deserving poor. The idle poor were those that were felt well enough to be able to get work and therefore didn't have a moral call upon the society to be supported. And these were often people who would end up being beggars, going around the countryside, and in some cases causing some disruption to society. The deserving poor were those who are elderly or infirm or too young to be expected to earn a living. And these people were considered worthy of some degree of support. However, Elizabeth was not minded to spend a lot of effort and energy on the poor initially in her reign. She saw her government's responsibilities as primarily directed towards other things, the defence of the realm being one of the key ones. She was threatened at this time with a number of possible attacks from European nations. However, the problem of poverty did increase, and particularly with the bad harvests in the 1590s, and therefore it was felt the government had to do something. And to do that, they looked at what had been done locally, and in Norwich there had been a very good example of how a council had been able to provide almshouses and work schemes and poor relief. And that was a template that was then used for the Poor Law Acts of 1597 and 1601. And these Poor Law Acts essentially made it the responsibility of local government to charge rates that would then be used to provide the almshouses, the poor relief, and try and address the issues of poverty through local means. And in fact, this was very successful because it continued for the next 250 years. It was effective. And it addressed one of the perennial concerns of Elizabethan society, and that was the potential for the poor to become a source of rebellions and social instability. And this wasn't the case in England because of these poor laws. What can we observe in all this? Well, we can observe that in many ways Elizabethan society, though not quick off the mark, did ultimately come round to finding a solution to this problem. And from a Christian perspective, it can be seen that the poor do need to be looked after. The weakest in society do need to be looked after. And this is a consistent theme throughout the Old Testament, and it was a theme that Paul, certainly in his letters, expected the churches to do, and he went around actually the Gentile churches collecting money for the poor because of the state of the church in Jerusalem was so much worse than it was in the Gentile nations. So the poor were always a need to be met, and the gospel is to the poor, and there is a real sense in which we have an obligation to meet our brother's needs. But the Bible's also under no illusions. Poverty will always be an issue, partly because the reality is that human beings don't always manage their lives well, and therefore there can be poverty that comes from our own poor choices. poverty can also be something that comes to us because of unfortunate circumstances. And, in one sense, poverty is a real issue that people face and may face sometimes at one point of their life, but not at another point. And therefore, some sort of safety mechanism needs to be in place. And it's a sort of combination, really, of whether the safety mechanism comes from the state or comes from personal charity. I think wisdom dictates it comes from both sources. The state can only provide so much. Actually, personal charity can provide a much more human face to the provision. The state can often be quite inhuman in its provision, not because it wants to, but because that's the nature of the state. I think the issue of addressing poverty is a very real and a very important issue, and Elizabethan government eventually came around to it. And interestingly, it shows that though Parliament may not have been flavour of the month for Elizabeth, actually it was important because it passed the laws that actually enabled the Poor Law Acts to be a nationally accepted, stable form of intervention into the poor. In terms of answering these questions from a GCSE perspective, it's important to make sure that the details are there about the difference between the idle poor and the deserving poor, and the causes of poverty, and details needed about the Norwich example of how the poor was dealt with, and the detailed understanding of the Poor Law Acts. Thank you for listening.